I only needed a place to sleep. Then I found something my family had hidden for decades.
No job, no room, no family willing to open a door, just a canvas tool roll and $10 she had kept folded behind her driver's license. And with that $10, she bought a condemned historic printing ink mill beside Frankford Creek in Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania, forgotten after 1937. The north roof had opened beside the chimney. One granite grindstone had split through its center. The county condemned the mill in August 2022 and scheduled demolition for the following spring. But beneath the cast-iron flange of its enormous ink trough lay a sealed hollow chamber, unopened for decades, holding what no inspector had known to seek. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Ines Mercer had been fixing things her whole life without knowing it. As a child in the row houses north of Kensington, she learned that broken objects had different voices. A loose hinge clicked before it failed. A dry bearing complained in a thin metallic whine. Her mother threw away lamps when their switches stopped working. Ines opened them on the kitchen floor, arranged the screws on a saucer, and found where the current had been interrupted. Her father had vanished before she could remember the sound of his shoes. Her mother, Elena, worked laundry shifts and measured security by what could be locked: doors, cupboards, money envelopes. She loved through caution, but caution hardened with years until every risk looked like disobedience. The gentler education came from Elena's father, Elias Mercer, who lived across the Delaware in an old brick duplex with a cellar workshop no wider than a railway car. Elias had spent 42 years repairing letterpress machinery, line shafts, ink fountains, and small industrial mills after most shops had abandoned them. Every Saturday morning he put chicory coffee on a hot plate, handed Ines a brown canvas apron, and chose one machine that had stopped doing what it was built to do. He never began with a wrench. First they listened. A treadle press might knock once every revolution. A shaft might drag only when its bronze bushing warmed. Elias made her touch housings with the backs of her fingers, smell old lubricant, mark gear teeth with chalk, and turn mechanisms by hand before applying power. Machines tell the truth slowly. Be patient enough. He meant that forcing an answer usually damaged the evidence. Ines carried that sentence into every repair she made afterward, though she did not yet understand that people could leave evidence too. Elias died when she was 19, after a short winter illness that reduced his strong hands to pale shapes on a hospital blanket. By the time Ines returned to his duplex, relatives had cleared the cellar. The machinist's chest was gone. So were his type gauges, composing sticks, oil cans, notebooks, and a curious silver-handled roller she remembered being forbidden to touch. She kept only the canvas tool roll he had once given her. 5 years later, she worked second shift at Haldane Precision Works, feeding steel blanks into aging milling machines beneath fluorescent tubes that hummed louder as midnight approached. The floor manager, Warren Klein, wore polished safety shoes that never seemed to gather filings. He watched production from a glass office raised above the shop floor and communicated mostly through printed quotas taped to machines. Breaks shortened without announcement. 2 operators were made to cover 4 stations. Maintenance requests waited until failure stopped production, after which Warren asked why no one had prevented the failure. Ines learned to keep her own measurements. On October 17, 2022, Warren descended from the office carrying 12 white envelopes. There had been no warning. The company was reducing headcount, he explained, shifting insurance exposure, consolidating operations. Workers whose hands still smelled of cutting fluid stood beneath the time clock while he read identification numbers instead of names. Ines received no severance. Her final pay had already been consumed by rent, groceries, and the small medical debt her mother had asked her to cover that summer. At 9:18 that night, she reached the boarding house where she rented an upstairs room and found her suitcase on the stoop. Mrs. Kell, the landlady, stood behind the storm door holding Ines's chipped blue coffee mug by its handle. She had apparently packed what she considered important and left the rest inside. "You have until midnight. Take only what's yours." 8 words. Ines looked past her toward the hallway. Her mother stood at the far end beside the telephone table. Elena had come earlier after hearing about the layoff. She did not step forward. She did not argue with Mrs. Kell or offer the sofa in her own apartment. She held her purse against her coat with both hands and lowered her eyes. Ines took the mug. Then she took the suitcase. At 11:43 p.m., she sat beneath the sodium lights of Kensington Avenue with the canvas tool roll across her knees and counted $10 in her wallet. For 6 weeks, she moved according to where she could remain without being questioned. The first nights were in Philadelphia, 2 hours at a time in the waiting room at Jefferson Station until security began recognizing her coat. Then a church basement near Spring Garden where cots were assigned before dusk. She spent $2.25 on oatmeal and coffee and stopped buying coffee after the third morning. When shelters filled, she crossed into Camden and slept one night upright in a 24-hour laundromat, her suitcase between her boots while dryers turned behind her like distant machinery. Another night she found an unlocked stairwell in a parking garage and woke every 40 minutes to footsteps. Her money fell to $637. She walked south toward Gloucester City, then took shelter behind stacked pallets at a produce warehouse until a driver found her before dawn and quietly pointed toward the road rather than calling police. In Chester, she slept beneath the covered entrance of a closed insurance office and used a public restroom at the transportation center to wash her face. She bought a packet of crackers for 89 cents, $4.11 remained. By the fifth week, cold had become less an event than a measurement. Which benches held warmth after sunset? Which libraries opened earliest? Which public buildings had outlets near chairs? She learned to fold newspaper beneath her shirt without making it visible beneath her coat. She did not sell Elias's tools. At the Free Library of Philadelphia on Vine Street, she spent afternoons reading repair manuals because technical pages allowed a person to sit quietly for hours without appearing lost. On November 29th, she turned from a book on belt-driven machinery and noticed a county disposal circular pinned crookedly beside the employment notices. One line had been underlined in red pencil: abandoned industrial property. For historic remediation, transfer. Below it was a photograph of a low brick building nearly hidden behind walnut trees. Historic printing ink mill. Structural hazards. Buyer assumes all liability. Minimum deed transfer, $10. Ines read the amount 3 times. At the reference desk, she asked for county maps, then traced Frankford Creek with one finger until she found the parcel. The mill stood miles from where she had been sleeping, but not beyond walking distance if she saved every remaining dollar for food. She copied the address onto the back of an expired bus transfer. For 6 weeks, $10 had been the difference between having almost nothing and having nothing at all. Now, the same amount had become a price. The next morning, Ines Mercer folded the classified advertisement into Elias's canvas tool roll and started toward the county office before sunrise. By nightfall, she would learn whether $10 could still buy a door that locked from the inside. The bus carried Ines northeast before dawn, windows gray with breath, then left her at a stop where the city had thinned into repair garages, narrow houses, and vacant industrial lots along the old creek corridor. She spent $2.75 of what remained on the ride and walked the final 6.4 miles. By afternoon, wet snow began needling across the road. She followed Frankford Avenue until traffic thinned, then cut toward the creek on a route copied from a library map. Her suitcase wheels failed first. One plastic hub split, forcing her to carry the case by its side handle while Elias's canvas tool roll stayed beneath her coat. That night, she slept in an abandoned hay barn behind a boarded farmhouse near the county line. The thermometer nailed outside the barn door read 29 degrees. She pushed loose hay into a shallow hollow between 2 beams, wrapped newspaper beneath her shirt, and slept with one hand around the handle of the tool roll. Wind moved through missing boards and made the rafters answer in dry wooden knocks. At sunrise, she walked again. The nearest commercial strip announced itself slowly. Bell's Hardware under a faded red awning, Doris May Cafe with steam clouding its front windows, Sutter Feed and Grain beside a rusted silo, a narrow pharmacy called Keen's, and Boyd Funeral Home occupying a brick house with white columns too clean for the street around it. Ines passed all 5. She had 6 quarters, 3 dimes, 1 nickel, and 4 pennies left in her pocket. The county clerk's office occupied the first floor of a squat limestone municipal building that smelled of wet wool, floor wax, and paper stored too long in metal cabinets. Behind the counter sat a woman with silver hair pinned so tightly that not one strand moved when she looked up. A brass nameplate read, Margaret Vale Deputy Property Clerk. Her left index finger was stained blue from a leaking stamp pad. You hear about something? The ink mill. Margaret stopped sorting envelopes. For several seconds she looked at Ines's coat, the suitcase with 1 broken wheel, then the folded disposal circular placed carefully on the counter. You understand there is no occupancy certificate. Yes, ma'am. You understand the county considers the roof unsafe. Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no guaranteed water, electrical service, heat, or sanitation. Yes, ma'am. You understand that once the deed transfers, every repair order and every liability attached to that parcel becomes yours. Yes, ma'am. Margaret leaned back. That answer getting heavy yet? Ines reached into her wallet. No, ma'am. She unfolded the $10 bill she had protected through 6 weeks of shelters, stations, stairwells, and cold rooms. Its center crease had gone soft from being opened and closed. Margaret did not take it immediately. You have somewhere else to stay tonight? I will if the deed is mine. The clerk's expression changed by less than an inch. Then she accepted the bill. There were 9 pages. Ines read every one. The property had transferred through tax seizure after the final registered owner died without active heirs. Environmental inspection had found no industrial contamination requiring state removal. Though old oils, pigments, unstable masonry, a damaged flue, and machinery hazards remained the buyer's responsibility. Demolition authorization would be canceled only after transfer and submission of a stabilization plan. Ines signed, Ines Mercer. Margaret's hand stopped over the brass embossing stamp. Mercer? Ines looked up. Yes. The clerk studied the name again. You related to Elias Mercer. The room became very quiet. He was my grandfather. Margaret lowered the stamp without pressing it. I knew him. Ines said nothing. He used to come through here maybe 25 years ago. Not for county business. He was helping a historical society inventory old machinery before that group folded. Margaret turned in her chair and opened a drawer packed with index cards. He argued with people about throwing things away. That sounds like him. The clerk gave the faintest smile. He argued politely, made it worse. She searched several cards, found one, and read, Mercer, Elias. Mechanical survey volunteer. Printing equipment, textile drives, small foundries. Her blue-stained finger moved down the card, then stopped. Inkworks, Frankford Creek parcel. Ines felt the edge of the counter beneath her palm. He knew the mill, apparently. Margaret turned the card toward her. Elias's name appeared in faded type beside an inspection date from 1989. No report was attached. I was 14 then. He may never have told you. No. Margaret watched her for a moment, then pushed the deed beneath the brass stamp and pulled the long handle down. The metal struck paper with a deep official clack. There, she gave Ines directions slowly enough to memorize. East on Frankford, left after the old stone culvert, follow the creek road 7/10 of a mile. When the pavement narrows to gravel, look for 2 black walnut trees leaning apart like a gate. The mill is behind them. She placed the deed in a manila envelope. The county sold you exactly what the papers say. Ines took it, and maybe, Margaret added, something they did not. Outside, the afternoon had sharpened. Ines walked east, carrying the suitcase because the broken wheel now dragged like an anchor. At the stone culvert, she met an elderly man in a brown quilted coat repairing a wire fence. A yellow-eyed shepherd mix stood beside him without barking. You looking for the mill? Ines stopped. Yes. The man pointed with his fencing pliers. Follow the water. Dog won't bother you. The dog watched her pass, then sneezed and sat down. The creek road narrowed exactly as Margaret had said. Black walnut trees appeared first, 2 enormous trunks angled away from one another, their bare crowns tangled over the lane. Beyond them stood the mill. It was smaller than the photograph had made it seem, a rectangular brick structure, perhaps 36 feet long and 22 wide, built from dark red common brick over a fieldstone foundation. The low gabled roof sagged slightly near the north chimney where several courses of brick had spalled white with frost. 3 window openings were boarded. Another held only triangular teeth of glass. Above the door hung a wooden sign so weathered that Ines had to stand close to read it. Mercer and Valprinter's inks and varnishes. She read the first word twice. Mercer. The door resisted until she lifted it slightly on its hinges. Inside, the smell reached her before the room became visible. Old linseed oil. Not fresh oil, but the sour resinous odor of varnish cooked too many times, mixed with dry soot and damp brick. It coated the back of her throat. Her boot touched grit. Something shifted in the darkness with a brittle scrape. She waited. Nothing moved again. The front room contained a long work table beneath 2 windows, shelves bowed with empty tins, and a cast-iron stove standing on 3 good legs and 1 brick. Light entered through holes in the boards and fell in pale columns filled with dust. She ran 1 finger over the table. Black pigment came away as fine as flour. The back room was colder. There the mill revealed what it had once been. 2 granite grinding stones occupied a heavy iron frame bolted into the floor. 1 stone remained upright beneath a belt pulley. The other had cracked and leaned against the wall in 2 massive pieces. Below the frame sat a broad cast-iron trough stained black along every seam. Ines touched its rim. The iron was colder than the air. Somewhere beneath the floor, water moved steadily. She listened. Creek water, perhaps, or drainage under the foundation. A chain hanging from an overhead shaft tapped once against metal. Then again, the sound reminded her of Elias's cellar, not the room itself, the waiting. She found the old hand pump outside before dark, but its handle moved without drawing water. The outhouse leaned badly enough that she did not trust the floor. There was no electricity when she tried the ceramic switch near the entrance. She returned inside. From the suitcase she removed 1 sweater, a wool scarf, 2 library newspapers, and the chip blue mug Mrs. Kell had handed her on the night of the eviction. She placed the mug on the work table. It was the first object in the building that belonged entirely to her. For supper, she ate the last crackers in her pocket and drank melted snow warmed only by holding the cup between her hands. Then she spread newspaper beneath her coat on the floor beside the cast-iron stove. The bricks released cold through every layer. Wind crossed the broken roofline and found openings too small to see. The building answered with small sounds, timber settling, loose glass ticking, a distant drip into metal. Ines lay awake looking toward the silhouette of the grinding mill. The deed rested beneath her head inside the manila envelope. Outside, Frankford Creek moved through the dark without asking who owned either bank. Inside, the old machinery waited. Machines tell the truth slowly. Be patient enough. By the 3rd morning, Ines had learned which boards complained before taking her weight. The plank beside the front stove gave 1 low groan. 2 near the back wall answered with sharp clicks. She began stepping around them automatically while carrying buckets from the well she had coaxed back to life by pouring 2 gallons of creek water down the pump throat, replacing a dried leather cup with a strip cut from an old boot, then working the handle until rusty water became merely cloudy. The outhouse required less finesse. She nailed a scrap board across the weakest joist, marked the unsafe side of the floor with charcoal, and used it carefully. Nothing in the place was comfortable, but each problem had an edge she could touch. On the 4th morning, she walked back to Bell's Hardware. The owner stood behind a scarred counter beneath rows of wooden drawers labeled with brass pulls. He was perhaps 70, with eyebrows so long they curled downward over the rims of his glasses. 1 thumb was flattened at the nail from an old hammer injury. The store smelled of kerosene, pine shelving, and galvanized metal. "You bought the ink place," he said. Ines set a chimney brush, stove cement, 3 feet of light chain, and a small box of screws on the counter. "I did. Margaret said somebody had." He looked at her purchases, then at her coat. "You heating it yet?" "Not until I know the chimney is open." "Good answer." His name was Arthur Bell. When Ines counted out coins and came up short, Arthur pushed the screws back toward her. "I can put you on account. I do not have income. That was not what I asked." She hesitated. "How much credit? Enough to make the building less interested in killing you." She almost smiled. Arthur opened a ledger and wrote her name in deliberate block letters. Beside the register, he added a thin paperback with a yellow cover. Home repair for owners of old houses. This one is free. I can pay for it later. No, you can return it when you've memorized the parts that keep rain and fire where they belong. She bought only what she could justify. A chimney brush for $3.60, stove cement for $1.15, a half-pound of cut nails for 82 cents, kerosene for 64 cents, and a second-hand handsaw Arthur marked at $2.25 on the new account. Then she walked back to the mill with the manual tucked beneath her shirt against the damp. The chimney took 6 hours. First, she removed the cast-iron stovepipe and found the horizontal section half-choked with flakes of creosote thick as bark. She carried each piece outside, tapped it with a wooden mallet, scraped the interior with a bent steel strap, then laid the sections in order on newspaper so she could reassemble them without forcing the joints backward. For the flue itself, she tied the round brush to the chain, climbed only as high as the lower roof could safely support her, and fed it downward from the chimney crown. It stopped after 4 feet. She pulled, fed it again, stopped. The blockage did not sound solid. She added a short iron nut to the brush head for weight and worked it in 6-inch strokes until something inside released. A black column fell into the stove opening. Creosote, soot, 2 bird nests, and the dry skeleton of a starling arrived together in a soft collapse that covered the hearth. Ines sat back on her heels, coughing into her sleeve. Then she cleaned the flue again and again. By late afternoon, a small square of sky was visible when she held a mirror beneath the opening. She sealed one cracked stovepipe joint with cement, packed the loose collar with furnace rope, and waited until the following morning before lighting anything. The first fire was no larger than both her hands. Newspaper, 3 dry walnut twigs, then split wood gathered beneath a fallen tree away from the creek. Smoke rose. For several seconds it hesitated inside the stove, then the draft caught and pulled cleanly upward. Ines remained crouched beside the open door until the first warmth reached her face. She did not add another log until she had walked outside and confirmed that pale smoke was leaving the chimney instead of the roof. That evening she heated water in a dented enamel saucepan Arthur had loaned her, boiled 2 potatoes bought on credit from Sutter Feed and Grain, and ate them with salt at the work table. Steam clouded the blue mug. The room smelled briefly like food instead of abandonment. Only then did she begin inventorying the back workroom. She used Elias's method. Do not move anything until you understand how it belongs. The standing granite runner stone measured nearly 4 feet across, its face cut with shallow channels blackened by decades of pigment. The cracked companion stone lay against the brick wall. A belt-driven shaft still crossed the ceiling on Babbitt bearings, though its leather belt had fallen into ribbons. There was a copper varnish kettle with a scorched bottom, a cast-iron ink knife wide as her palm. 3 stoneware crocks whose interiors shone black, a balance scale missing 1 brass weight, a wooden rack holding 12 hardened glass mullers, and beneath the grinding frame the enormous trough she had noticed on the first night. It was not merely a catch basin. The trough had been built as part of the mill, heavy cast iron, nearly 7 feet long, with curved ends and a broad flange bolted to stone supports. Dried ink had accumulated along its corners in black ridges that cracked like old lacquer when she pressed them. She spent an hour scraping only enough to expose the fasteners. Most were ordinary square-headed bolts. One was not. Near the rear flange, beneath a skin of soot and oxidized oil, Ines found a circular iron disc about 8 inches across. No bolt heads, no hinge, no obvious purpose. She tapped the main trough with the wooden handle of her ink knife. Clang! She moved 12 inches. Clang! Near the disc, the sound changed. Talk Ines stopped. She tapped again. Talk, a hollow lay behind the iron. She cleaned the edge with kerosene and a rag until a narrow seam appeared. The disc was not iron after all. It was cedar, blackened deliberately and seated flush inside a cast recess. She tried the ink knife beneath its edge. Nothing. She tried the small pry blade from Elias's tool roll. The cedar moved perhaps the thickness of paper, then settled. Ines stood and examined the trough rather than forcing it. The entire casting seemed too heavy to contain empty space without reason. She found a length of pipe, placed one end beneath the rear flange, and leaned her weight gently against it. The trough did not move. She added a block as a fulcrum, still nothing. Then she noticed something on the floor. 4 iron feet supported the trough. 3 had left deep rust marks. The 4th had not. She knelt. That corner was carrying less weight. A hidden cavity would explain some of it, not all. Ines fetched the balance scale and, using rope, the pipe, and a series of measured lifts against each corner, compared how much effort each side required. It was crude, but the rear section was unquestionably lighter than a solid casting of the same thickness should have been. She returned to the cedar disc. This time she warmed the surrounding iron slowly with cloths soaked in hot water, hoping expansion would loosen whatever had bound the wood. After 20 minutes, she worked the blade around the seam. The disc rose. A smell escaped first: cedar, dry paper, old metal. Behind the disc was a cylindrical opening leading into a chamber cast inside the trough's hollow base. Ines did not put her hand inside. She brought the kerosene lamp closer. Something wrapped in waxed cloth lay 6 inches beyond the opening. She made a hook from light chain and stiff wire, caught the package, and drew it forward 1 inch at a time. The first bundle weighed perhaps 10 pounds. The second was longer. The third resisted until she changed the hook angle. Then came a narrow tin box with a soldered lid. She placed everything on the work table. Outside, the light had already begun fading. Ines washed her hands. Only then did she open the first package. The waxed cloth had been folded in layers, each tied with a cotton cord that broke when she bent it. Inside lay tools: a pair of steel ink knives polished bright beneath grease, 3 brass temperature gauges, a granite hand muller with a walnut grip, a small set of engraved ratio spoons, and 1 roller no longer than her forearm, wrapped separately in linen. She removed the cloth. Silver, not plated steel. The roller cylinder itself had the soft gray sheen of aged sterling, its handles dark ebony. Ines remembered the seller. Her fingers stopped. Elias had once owned one exactly like it. Or perhaps this was the one. She set it down carefully. The longer package contained sealed glass jars, pine lamp black so fine it shifted like smoke when tilted, reddish-brown resin chips, powdered mineral pigment, and a dark amber mass labeled in faded handwriting, Baltic Amber, varnish grade. The tin box took longer. She did not pry it. She heated the solder seam with the lamp chimney nearby, just enough to soften old wax that had been brushed over the lid. Then she worked the smallest screwdriver beneath one corner. The lid released with a quiet metallic sigh. On top lay a folded packet of manuscript pages tied with linen tape. She did not open them. Beneath the manuscript were envelopes. Money. Not modern bank straps, but currency divided into paper packets, coins wrapped in cloth tubes, and a narrow leather purse gone stiff with age. Ines sat down. She counted because counting was a procedure, and procedure kept the hands steady. First the notes, 20s, 50s, hundreds. Some older, some newer than the mill's apparent closing date, suggesting that someone had returned to the chamber long afterward. She wrote each subtotal on the back page of Arthur's repair manual, then the coins. Morgan silver dollars. Walking Liberty, $half. Indian head gold eagles. Several Liberty head double eagles wrapped individually in tissue. At the bottom of the leather purse lay a tarnished military medal stamped with the year 1918. She turned it once beneath the lamp, saw the ribbon folded behind it, and placed it apart from the money. She counted everything twice, then a third time. $41,200 exactly, not $41,000. Not a round inheritance, $41,200. She sat alone at the old ink work table with enough money to change every immediate condition of her life. The roof could be repaired, the windows glazed, food purchased without arithmetic, a room rented elsewhere by morning, but the money did not feel like permission. It felt like evidence. The manuscript remained tied. Beneath it lay an envelope with writing across the front. The handwriting was narrow, right-slanted, and familiar in a way that made Ines move the lamp closer without touching it. She knew those letters, not every word, the hand. Elias had labeled tool drawers that way. She picked up the envelope, then put it down. For the first time since opening the chamber, she stopped following procedure. She could not read it yet. Ines returned every coin to its cloth or envelope, wrapped the tools again except for the silver roller, and carried the tin box into the front room. Then she walked outside. Night had settled over Frankford Creek. Thin ice had formed along the slow edges while the center continued moving dark between the banks. Bare walnut branches crossed the sky above her. Somewhere upstream, water struck stone in a steady rhythm too soft to have heard from the road. Ines stood there until the cold entered her sleeves. Behind her, beneath the roof that still leaked and beside a stove that had burned its first clean fire in years, an unopened letter waited on the table. She watched the water instead. Machines tell the truth slowly. Be patient enough. Morning came colorless through the boarded windows. Ines made no fire at first. She sat at the work table wearing her coat, the unopened envelope before her, and studied the handwriting until memory supplied what the years had blurred. Elias formed a capital M with a narrow first stroke and crossed every T farther to the right than it belonged. The envelope was not addressed to her. On the front, in that unmistakable hand, were 4 words, "For whoever comes after." She opened it with the smallest ink knife. Inside were 6 pages folded twice. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you are reading this, then you have opened the hollow beneath the grinding trough and found what we could not carry away. I hope you opened it carefully. The cedar cover swells when damp. Never force old wood when patience will do less damage. My name is Elias Mercer. In March of 1989, Dr. Samuel Rosen at Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia told me I had pulmonary fibrosis and that the work of my lungs would become harder before it stopped. He was kind enough not to pretend certainty where none existed. I began putting my papers in order that spring. This mill belongs to a line of work older than any one owner. Nathaniel Mercer began grinding printer's black near Frankford Creek in 1788 after apprenticing in Philadelphia. His daughter, Ruth Mercer Vale, kept the varnish kettles and accounts after 1816. Her son, Thomas Vale, expanded the works in 1854 and supplied small presses from Pennsylvania to Maryland. Thomas's granddaughter, Clara Mercer, returned here in 1897, when other relatives had already gone west and worked until the old trade closed on October 3, 1957. After that date, the stones were silent for more than 30 years. My grandfather taught me enough to know what had been lost, though not enough to restore all of it. My older brother Daniel carried part of the knowledge and never brought it home. He was killed in France during the Meuse-Argonne fighting in October 1918. The metal in the box was his. There are things you must understand before touching the formulas. Raw linseed oil is not ink. It must first be made into varnish by heat, time, and restraint. Bring clean oil so slowly toward 500 degrees in an open iron kettle, never indoors, and never hurry the rise. For ordinary black, begin with approximately 1 part lamp black to 3 parts heavy varnish by weight. Then adjust only after grinding. Amber resin must be introduced in small pieces while the oil is hot enough to dissolve it, but below the point where the oil begins smoking violently. The granite does work that stirring cannot. Run the mixture between the stones slowly for no less than 6 hours on a first grinding. 12 is better for dense black. If a sample pulled between thumb and knife shows grains beneath reflected light, it is not finished. Let the stones cool before tightening them. Heat changes both the oil and your judgment. You will find another formula among these papers. It uses cooked linseed varnish, lamp black, and Baltic amber. The proportions look wrong at first. Follow them exactly before deciding whether the old makers were fools. That varnish dries with a gloss unlike ordinary pressed black and holds to metal type without crawling into the shoulders of the letters. Do not sell the silver roller for scrap. It is a proofing roller, made when silver was used because the maker wanted a surface that would neither rust nor easily contaminate pale pigments. It belonged to Ruth. As for the money, some came from the family, some from machinery I repaired, and some from years when I lived more cheaply than I needed to. I hid it here because I could not find anyone who wanted the burden that came with the building. Inheritance is not being handed something valuable. It is being handed unfinished work. You are not required to continue it. You owe the dead nothing merely because they are dead. But before you throw away an old trade, learn why someone kept it. Heat the oil once. Grind one small batch, clean the stones properly, put ink on type and press it into honest paper, then decide. The pressure inside those stones is severe enough to crush what the eye cannot see. Carbon is only darkness until oil gives it body. Oil is only liquid until pressure joins the two closely enough to leave a mark that can outlive the hand that made it. That may be all our family ever understood. There should be enough money to make the building safe if the right person finds it. Use what is necessary. Keep what ought to be kept. Do not worship any of it. If the roof leaks, repair the roof before reading another formula. If the chimney is bad, fix that before you sleep beside it. If you are hungry, eat. Those instructions matter more than ink. I do not know your name. I do not know whether you are Mercer, Vale, or a stranger who paid almost nothing for a ruin everyone else was pleased to forget. That is why this is written to you. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elias Nathaniel Mercer, November 12, 1991. Ines read the letter twice. The second time, she moved more slowly through Daniel's name, through Ruth, through the date the trade had closed. Then she aligned the 6 pages on the table and folded them along their original creases. She did not smooth the folds flat. Elias had already done that once. On the final page, beneath his signature, a penciled note she had missed directed the reader through the back door. West Walnut. 3 paces from root flare, low stone. Ines carried the letter outside. The western walnut stood beyond the mill near the creek bank, its trunk broad enough that 3 people could not have joined hands around it. Snow had gathered in the ridges of its bark. She measured 3 paces from where the roots widened into the ground. At first, she saw only frozen leaves, then her boot struck stone. Ines knelt and cleared the surface with her glove. A small granite marker lay almost level with the soil. Cut into it was the same symbol stamped faintly into the handle of the silver proofing roller. 2 overlapping circles crossed by a horizontal line. Beneath the mark were 3 letters EMM. He stayed there until her knees became cold through her trousers. Back inside, she opened one of the wrapped heirloom bundles and removed a small brass whale oil lamp with a dented reservoir. She cleaned the wick channel with wire, filled it with kerosene, and struck a match. The wick caught unevenly. She lowered it. The flame steadied into a quiet oval. For the first time, Elias's old lamp burned beside the letter he had left behind. That afternoon, kindnesses she had barely registered while surviving returned with exact faces. Arthur Bell, with his flattened thumbnail, had opened a credit ledger for someone with no income. Margaret Vale had pressed the deed stamp, then copied Elias's old index card for her before she left. The produce driver in Gloucester City had found her sleeping behind pallets and pointed silently toward a safer road instead of calling the police. At Doris May Cafe that morning, before Ines could admit she had almost no money, Doris had wrapped 2 biscuits in waxed paper and said somebody had ordered too many. None of those acts had changed the world. Each had changed 1 hour. Sometimes 1 hour was enough. So let me ask you something before we go farther. Was there ever one small kindness someone gave you when they had no idea how badly you needed it? A meal, a ride, a warm room, a few quiet words, you may still remember their face. That night, Ines placed the silver roller, Elias's letter, Daniel's medal, and the granite hand muller beside her sleeping place. She did not count the money again. The lamp burned low on the work table until she reached over, turned the wick down carefully, and let the old mill return to darkness. December 2nd brought the first real snow. 4 inches settled over the walnut roots and softened the collapsed edge of the roof until the damage looked less urgent than it was. Ines knew better. She read the roofing chapter in Arthur's yellow manual 3 times before climbing the ladder. The mill roof measured roughly 38 by 24 feet across both slopes. Allowing for waste and overlap, she calculated 27 bundles of asphalt shingles, 2 rolls of roofing felt, and 40 pounds of galvanized nails. She bought only enough material to repair the north slope properly and stabilize the south until spring. Arthur Bell carried the first bundles to the counter and placed an old roofing hatchet on top. The handle was dark from decades of use. "My brother's," he said. "He won't need it." Ines opened her mouth. Arthur raised his flattened thumb. "Bring it back sharp." 2 days later, a narrow old man named Walter Haynes appeared at the mill wearing wool trousers beneath bib overalls. He had roofed houses for 47 years before his knees made ladders unreasonable. Arthur had sent him. "I cannot pay you." Walter looked toward the broken ridge. "Good. Then we won't argue about wages." He refused to climb higher than the lower staging, but from there he taught her how to sister the damaged rafter with straight 2x6 lumber bolted beyond the split, how to snap a chalk line without letting wind bow it, and how to set each roofing nail with 3 hammer strokes: start, drive, seat not 4, not 7, 3. To the 5th morning Walter pointed upward. "That nail's proud." Ines tapped it. "Pull it." She did. 11 days passed in measured sections: strip, inspect, repair, felt, line, shingle. Snow melted beneath the afternoon sun and froze each evening along the eaves. Her shoulders learned the weight of bundles. Her knees learned where not to rest. On December 14th, she drove the last ridge nail. Walter stood below with both hands on his cane and looked up for a long time. "It'll shed water." From him, that was praise. Ines returned the roofing hatchet to Arthur sharpened. He put it back in her hand. January exposed what the roof had hidden. The chimney looked sound from the ground, but when Ines climbed to inspect the upper courses, several bricks had begun spalling. Their fired faces had broken away in thin plates, leaving soft red interiors exposed to frost. Lower joints had lost mortar completely. In places, she could rub the bedding material between 2 fingers and reduce it to powder. She dismantled only what was loose. Arthur found hydraulic lime in the back storage room and showed her how to mix a repair mortar suited to old brick rather than trapping moisture behind hard modern cement. For the heat-facing joints near the flue, she blended 1 part fire clay with 2 parts hydraulic lime mortar, mixing only enough for a morning's work. January stayed mostly in the 20s. Mortar could not be allowed to freeze while curing, so she worked short sections, wrapped the repairs with burlap, and shielded the chimney with canvas whenever the forecast dropped sharply. She wore gloves for carrying brick. She removed them for pointing. Bare fingers gave better control when packing the narrow joints, but every 15 minutes her hands became too numb to feel whether the mortar was firm or merely cold. She would climb down, warm them near the stove until they hurt, then climb back up. 3 weeks passed that way. The final test fire came on January 28th. Ines warmed the flue gently with twisted newspaper before adding kindling. The stove caught. Smoke rose through the repaired throat without spilling from the joints. She went outside. A pale column lifted cleanly from the chimney and bent east above the walnut trees. She watched it until the first log settled into coals. Then she went inside and made soup. By late January, the floors had become impossible to ignore. The original white pine planks were nearly black beneath generations of soot, spilled oil, and grime carried in from the yard. Several replacement boards were beyond saving, but most remained sound beneath the surface. Ines found salvaged white pine for the missing sections and fastened them with hand-cut rose-head nails, setting each head slightly below the surface without crushing the wood fibers. Arthur rented her a random orbit sander for $14 per day. "Return it before 5 tomorrow." "Oh, I will. You said that about the hatchet. You gave that back." Arthur considered this. Fair. She sanded in 3 passes. 80 grit removed the old hardened surface. 120 erased the coarse scratches. 220 softened the grain enough for oil without polishing it shut. The dust was relentless. It settled in her hair, on the window ledges, inside the cuffs of her coat. She vacuumed twice and wiped the boards with cloth until no pale residue appeared. Then came 3 thin coats of oil, each worked along the grain and wiped before becoming tacky. The transformation was slow. What had looked almost black began as dark honey beneath the first coat, then deepened toward mahogany as the grain absorbed the second and third. She gave the final coat 48 hours to cure. During that time, she slept on boards laid temporarily across the back workroom. One morning, she woke before sunrise with every small task arranged in her head and discovered she could not begin any of them. She walked to the marsh beyond the creek. A great blue heron stood motionless in shallow water. Ines sat on a fallen trunk and watched it for nearly 3 hours. It moved only twice. She did no work that day. The next morning, she returned to the mill and buffed the cured floor by hand. February belonged to the windows. There were 8. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held cracked panes that rattled when the wind pressed them. The 8th contained one surviving original pane, wavy and slightly green, dated by the old glazing and frame construction to the mill's earliest period around 1788. Ines did not remove it. She repaired around it. For the others, she scraped only loose putty, preserved soundwood wherever possible, primed bare rabbets, and bedded replacement glass into thin ribbons of DAP 33 glazing compound. Arthur showed her how to roll the putty warm between both palms before pressing it into place. "Knife low," he said, "one clean pull." The sash cords were worse. Several had rotted completely, leaving counterweights resting at the bottom of the pockets. Ines used quarter-inch cotton sash cord, fed it over the pulleys, then tied each cast-iron counterweight with a figure-8 knot that tightened under load without slipping. She balanced every sash before replacing the access covers. The final window faced west. By then, she could remove a stop, free a sash, replace cord, set glass, and tool the glazing without consulting the manual. She was pressing the last bead of putty when a chickadee landed on a walnut branch outside the open frame. It cocked its black-capped head toward her. Ines stopped moving. The bird stayed for perhaps 5 seconds, then it crossed the creek and disappeared among the bare trees. She finished the final corner with one clean pull of the knife. The plaster waited until late February. Behind the cracked walls, Ines found hand-split oak lath, irregular and hard, with the pale remnants of horsehair plaster still hooked through the gaps. Near the chimney, her first 3 patches failed. The first dried too quickly and cracked. The second sagged from the lath. The third looked sound until she pressed it the next morning and felt the center shift. Arthur Bell brought an old burlap bag from his storage loft. My father saved this for plaster. Inside was coarse horsehair, clean and dry. Ines mixed lime plaster slowly, folded in the hair by hand, and began again. The scratch coat went on first, pressed firmly through the oak lath and scored while still green. Over that, she laid a 3/8-inch brown coat, leveled it carefully, and left it 72 hours to cure beneath damp cloth. The final coat was barely 1/8 inch thick. When the chimney wall had hardened, she ran her palm over the repaired surface. "These patches will hold another 100 years, she said it quietly. No one was there to agree. February also brought people to the door. Doris May arrived first, a compact woman with silver hoops in both ears and flower on the sleeve of her green cardigan. She never knocked. Paper bags simply began appearing on the doorstep, biscuits, a heel of ham. Once, 3 apples and a jar of soup. When Ines carried money to the cafe, Doris pushed her hand away with the edge of a coffee pot. "In candles when the shop reopens." Then she turned to refill a truck driver's cup before Ines could explain that there was no shop. Caleb came on a blue Schwinn bicycle. He was 16, all elbows and long wrists, with one shoelace permanently untied. A splitting maul lay across his handlebars. "He stopped beside the woodpile," my mother said. "About your grandfather." Those were nearly all the words he offered. He split walnut and maple for 3 hours, stacking the pieces bark up beneath the lean-to. When Ines tried to pay him, Caleb looked embarrassed, mounted the Schwinn, and rode away without taking the bills. Reverend Boyd walked the creek road every morning at 7:10. He had a white beard trimmed square beneath his jaw and carried the same black umbrella in sun or rain. He never came inside. Each day he tipped his hat. One morning, when Ines was standing on the step with plaster dust in her hair, he stopped. "May your hands endure." 4 words. Then he continued toward town. The cellar remained closed until February 11th. Ines had known it existed from the shallow stairs behind the workroom, but the lowest steps disappeared beneath fallen brick and black silt. She postponed clearing it until the roof, chimney, and windows were safe. The room below measured 12 by 15 feet. 7 granite steps descended to a fieldstone floor. At the center lay one dressed granite slab, unlike the rough stones around it. Cut into its surface was the same old craft mark she had found on Ruth's silver roller and the marker beneath the walnut tree. Overlapping circles crossed by a horizontal line. Ines cleaned the edges. She did not lift it. Elias had taught her not to disturb something merely because it could be disturbed. Beneath the third granite step, however, she found an object already displaced. A small oak box had been wedged into a cavity behind the riser. Inside lay a brass key. Its bow had been shaped into the old ink maker's symbol. Beneath it rested a tintype wrapped in yellowed tissue. A young woman stood outside the mill in the summer light of another century. She wore a high-necked blouse with the sleeves rolled above her wrists. In one hand she held a long ink knife. Her face made Ines sit down on the cellar step, the same narrow jaw, the same heavy brows. Even the slight downward turn of the left corner of the mouth was familiar. On the reverse, scratched carefully into the plate, Clara Mercer, daughter of Thomas Mercer, age 25, summer of 1903. Ines carried the key upstairs. She placed it on the mantel beside Elias's lamp. For weeks she tried it nowhere. By March, snow pulled away from the mill in gray ridges. Frankford Creek grew loud with runoff, striking the stone banks hard enough to hear through the closed windows. The walnut trees produced their first hanging catkins, pale green against dark branches. Ines read the ink formulas again. She made one decision. She would not attempt to restore the full trade that spring. 1 coin from the cash would buy oil, pigment, resin, paper, and enough type to practice on small samples, no more. She would learn the work before asking the old machinery to perform it. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Ines stood before the restored granite mill with 1 ounce of finished black ink resting on a steel slab. It had taken 11 failed batches. 2 varnishes had scorched, 1 separated after cooling, another dried beautifully on paper but clung to the type so aggressively that it pulled fibers from the sheet. The 12th was different. She had cooked the linseed oil outdoors in a small iron kettle, raised it slowly through the difficult temperatures, dissolved measured amber into the varnish, and mixed lampblack until the mass held together like dark honey. Then she had run it beneath the granite, not 6 hours. 10. At midnight she stopped the stones, placed a trace of ink between knife and thumb, and tilted it beneath the lamp. No grain. She inked a small line of hand-set metal type, Mercer and Vale. 1 sheet of cotton rag paper went into the press. The impression came away black, glossy, and exact. Ines hung it over the work table to dry. She did not make another. The mill interior had changed without becoming new. White pine floors held their deep brown color beneath worn runners. Lime plaster followed the old walls without hiding their irregularity. The copper varnish kettle had been cleaned but not polished bright. The granite stones still carried stains no solvent could remove. Elias's lamp remained on the table. The silver roller remained wrapped when not in use. Nothing had been restored past the point of memory. The brass key waited longer. Ines had tried drawers, chests, old cabinet locks, even a plate beneath the grinding frame. Nothing fit. Then, during the winter pruning of 2024, Caleb noticed a rectangle of green metal on the western walnut. Was that always there? The plate had nearly disappeared beneath bark. It stood chest-high on the creek side of the trunk. A small brass escutcheon swallowed around the edges as the tree had grown. Ines fetched the key. It turned. Inside the tree was not a hollow chamber in the trunk itself, but a narrow copper box inserted decades earlier into an old pruning scar and sealed behind the plate. The box contained a folded 48-star American flag. Beneath it lay a note dated October 21, 1918. The handwriting belonged to Clara Mercer. Daniel has not returned, and today the telegram made certain what the silence already told us. Thomas wants the flag put away because he cannot bear seeing it above the shop. I cannot bear throwing it into a trunk where mice will take it, so I am leaving it here, beside the tree Daniel climbed when we were children. He said ink was proof that pressure could make darkness useful. I told him that sounded like something a printer would say after drinking. I wish now I had written down more of his foolishness. Whoever opens this, do not make a shrine of grief. Use the shop. Keep the tree alive. Remember him by making something that lasts. Clara Mercer folded the note along its old creases. The flag remained in the copper box until spring. On May 30th, 2025, she carried Daniel's 1918 medal to the Philadelphia National Cemetery. There was no ceremony. She stood before the rows of government stones with Reverend Boyd, Arthur, and Caleb, then placed the medal beside a small folded copy of Clara's note while the noon traffic moved beyond the cemetery wall. Afterward, the medal returned to the mill. It belonged with the family papers. The money remained almost untouched. Ines spent 3 gold coins and 2 silver dollars over the first 2 years. 1 paid for structural lumber, 1 for chimney materials, 1 for the first careful restoration of the grinding bearings. The silver dollars paid for paper, oil, pigment, and type. Everything else went back into protective envelopes. She replaced the cedar disc over the hollow chamber but did not hide the existence of the cash from herself. Inside the tin box, she added 1 new envelope. On it, she wrote, "For the next one." The mill reopened without announcement. Doris made the announcement anyway. One morning, an index card appeared on the corkboard beside the cafe register. Hand-ground letterpress ink, small batches, Mercer and Vale. Ink Millisk, Doris for the listings. Discovered it after 4 people had already written their names beneath it. She confronted no one. Doris poured coffee. "You owe me candles." By autumn, the mailing list held 43 names. Most were small printers, a bookbinder in Lancaster, a letterpress studio in Baltimore, a woman in Vermont who printed wedding invitations on a treadle press inherited from her aunt. Orders remained deliberately small. Ines refused anything that would require rushing the varnish or running the stones continuously. Some months she made £12, some months none. On a mild October afternoon, Caleb returned carrying a pine board wrapped in an old blanket. He had grown taller and now drove a battered pickup instead of the Schwinn. Without explanation, he leaned the board against the work table. The carving was plain. Mercer and Val printers, inks and varnishes and daughter signs read the last 2 words. There were no daughters in the business name. Caleb shrugged. There were in the building. He had carved the letters by hand, leaving shallow tool marks along the edges. Ines touched one. "You spelled everything right. That took 3 tries." She looked at him. Caleb looked toward the door. "I burned the first 2. Ines laughed once. It startled both of them. They hung the sign beneath the old one, not replacing it. That winter, Ines began a letter. She used heavy rag paper and one of Elias's fountain pens. For 3 evenings she wrote nothing beyond the first line. "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she continued. She did not explain everything. She wrote where the roof leaked first, which bearing warmed faster than the others, how long to let the amber varnish rest before judging its body, where Arthur kept the older hydraulic lime in case Bell's hardware remained open. She wrote that Doris would refuse payment and should be allowed to win occasionally. She wrote that the granite slab in the cellar had never been lifted. She wrote that the brass key belonged back on the mantel after use, and she wrote what Elias had taught her before she understood it. Machines tell the truth slowly. Be patient enough. By then, those words no longer belonged only to machines. They belonged to roofs repaired 1 course at a time, to ink ground until darkness became smooth enough to print, to strangers who gave food without asking for gratitude, to old letters that waited until someone had enough shelter to read them. On winter evenings when the grinding stones stopped, Frankford Creek could still be heard beneath the silence. Ines would wipe the ink knife clean, close the ledger, and leave 1 small lamp burning in the front window while she carried the day's paper scraps to the stove. Outside, the new sign moved slightly when the wind crossed the walnut branches. Inside, the first proof from December 2024 remained framed above the press. Mercer and Vale. The ampersand was imperfect. 1 shoulder of the metal type had held too much ink. Ines never reprinted it. The historic printing ink mill waits. It has always waited. Years earlier, Margaret Vale had accepted a worn $10 bill across the county counter and placed it in the cash drawer before stamping the deed. She never sent that particular bill to the bank. It remained inside the back of her desk drawer, flattened beneath Elias Mercer's old index card. On her final day before retirement, Margaret found both. She folded the bill once along its softened center crease. Then she placed it back where it had been waiting.